smocking, shirring, are they the same thing? And can you substitute one for another in a sewing pattern? Welcome. I'm Lisa from Pink Holly Bush Designs, where we talk all things sewing and smocking. Not necessarily shirring, but today we're going to talk about shirring as well. So let's dive in. Let's talk about the differences and when can you substitute one for another. So first up, let's get our definitions straight. Okay, shirring is a machine gathering technique. There are parallel lines of stitching and elastic thread used in the bobbin that gathers the fabric together. Now, traditional English smocking is hand embroidery done on pre-pleated fabric. So again, there's parallel rows of stitching done about 1/3 to 1/2 inch apart to gather up the pleated fabric, and then the hand embroidery stitches are done over the top. Once the embroidery is done, the holding stitches, the holding rows of stitching are removed. In traditional smocking, the gathering cannot be done on a sewing machine. I wish it could, but it needs to be done either by hand or using a pleater. And that's because in order to form those parallel rows of pleats, the gathering needs to enter and exit the fabric at the exact same point on every row of stitching. The sewing machine does not let you do that, unfortunately. Okay, to further add to the confusion, right now in ready to wear, you'll see a lot of tops or dresses that are labeled smocked tops or smocked dresses. And in those cases, what they actually are tops or dresses that have been shirred, and then a machine embroidered stitch is done over the top of the shirring so that it mimics hand smocking. Okay, I've got you thoroughly confused now, right? I hope not. But why? I'm sure you're trying to think of that. Why? Well, let's talk about what both of these, both shirring and smocking, as I said, are a gathering technique, and they're a gathering technique that's used to mold and shape the fabric to the body. So traditionally it's done to pull in the fullness of the fabric in areas where you would want it pulled in. So let me show you. So in this little smocked bishop, you can see that the smocking is pulling in the fullness and pulling it in around the neckline. Another place that it would typically be done is across a bodice, and then you can see where the smocking stops, it just releases the fullness of the fabric. Again, shirring would do the same thing for you. And the third place that it is typical is at the bottom of a sleeve. Now here in this little top, I didn't smock it, I just used elastic there, but you could have a couple rows here of either shirring or smocking, and both would pull in this sleeve just like the piece of elastic does. The other place you typically would see this, especially right now, pretty popular on women's clothes, is at the bottom, not my little top there, is at the bottom of a long sleeve. You can have that bishop sleeve that then ends in that really long gathered shirred cuff. And that could also be, you could have smocking there as well. So the second thing, I should say, that both shirring and smocking have in common is, besides gathering, they both provide elasticity. So the shirring has that elasticity because of the elastic thread, but the smocking Well, that's why smocking was invented. If you're wondering who thought that it was a good idea to embroider over pleated fabric, it's to provide that elasticity before we ever had elastic. So hopefully you can see here my little bishop, but right here, okay, it stretches and it bounces right back. Smocking is very elastic, and depending on what stitches are used, some are more elastic than others, it pulls in and it shapes that garment, but it also allows then it to stretch out as the body moves. So here, the only thing that's preventing it is the binding at the top. That's stopping the elasticity, but the actual smocking is very elastic. And you can imagine if you had this on a cuff, for example, and you didn't put any binding at the edge of the cuff, your hand could go right through that cuff. It would stretch and then it would pull back. Now, the reason that the smocking is elastic is if you imagine a pleat, let's say this is the bottom of the pleat and this is the top of the pleat. When the smocking's done, the embroidery stitches are only taken in the top third of those pleats. So the needle and thread don't go down to the bottom of the pleat, they just take a bite in the top third. So the result of that is, use this little one, the pleats are held together by the embroidery stitches, but because the embroidery is only in that top, the bottom of it can still be stretching out and come right back. There, I can see it that way. See it? It stretches and it comes right back because the bottom of the pleats are free to stretch out and then come back because there's no stitching down at the bottom of the pleats. So I happen to think that kind of thing is very interesting, and our ancestors developed that hundreds of years ago. So let's talk about some other things they have in common. We said they both are a gathering technique. They both provide that elasticity. Both shirring and smocking provide texture. And texture is something else that's very popular right now. So if you want a fabric to have some depth and some texture, both of these techniques will provide it. The last thing that they have in common is that both of them work best on a lightweight fabric, which is why you typically see them in summer garments. So the shirring technique will not do a great job. That elastic thread would have a harder time pulling in a heavier weight fabric such as a corduroy or a cotton duck. That's why you typically see them done with a lightweight fabric like a cotton lawn or a batiste. Smocking is similar. It can be done with some heavier fabrics like a very fine weel corduroy, but typically you see it done with those cotton lawns or batistes, again, because of the fullness of the fabric that you're bringing in and gathering. So, can you substitute one for another? And particularly if a pattern calls for shirring, can you substitute smocking or vice versa? Well, it's a good place to start, but you do need to do some modifications. And the reason for that is the amount of gathering that the two different techniques have. So for example, shirring has a 1.5 to 1 or a 2 to 1 ratio when it's gathered. And what that means is that 2 inches of unsheared fabric will end up being 1 inch of shirred fabric once you've done the technique. Traditional English smocking has a 3 to 1 ratio. So 3 inches of ungathered fabric end up as 1 inch finished once it's smocked. So for example, if you had a pattern that called for shirring and the finished piece was going to be 10 inches wide, that the original pattern piece would start out as 15 inches wide or 10 inches wide, and then would be shirred down to that finished width of 10 inches. Did I say 50? It starts out as 15 inches or 20 inches and reduces down to the 10 inches. Okay. If you were doing smocking for that same pattern piece, you need to start out with a 30-inch wide piece of fabric that is then going to get smocked down to a 10-inch wide piece. So while it's a great place to start using a pattern that's designed for one or the other, if you're trying to substitute them, there will be those modifications that you will need to make so that you have the width that you need at the end. If you are interested in learning more about smocking, I have a whole Get Started Smocking email series. You will find the link for that below. I hope you will check it out and check out some of the many other smocking videos that I have as well. I will put a link to a smocking playlist, and you can see some other videos that we have along those lines. I hope you will give smocking a try, and I hope that this explains the difference a little bit between the two techniques. Happy smocking!